And welcome to another episode of WOT'SAp Fridays. We have two more events left for this season's academic year's series of events. And you can find, as usual, information about it on our website, and a link to it will be in the chat box in a second. So we're taking a little break over the summer holidays, and we're going to be resuming our series in September. And in the meantime, we may have one or two ad hoc events in response to the developments in Turkey and the US. Just stay tuned for those. We'll be announcing these through the usual channels. For those of you who do not know, my name is İpek Kocamer Yosmoğlu, and I teach at the Northwestern History Department, and I'm also the current president of OTSA. And today it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Timur Hammond, and who is an associate professor in the Geography and the Environment Department at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. I should also mention that Timur is an officer of OTSA. He's been serving in the nominations committee, for which we are extremely thankful. And I also wanted to mention that I was recently at a book panel in Columbia University, which is a very strange place right now, as you can imagine. But this was a book panel by a really dear friend of mine, and there was an anthropologist on the panel, and he reminded me that many years ago, when we met at a conference in 2005, he's an anthropologist. Apparently, I told him, and he still remembers this, that anthropologists, you guys think you are the cool kids on the block, but you are not going to be, there forever. You'll be knocked down off your pedestal by geographers. Geographers are the new cool guys. And I am happy to say that I told him so. And our speaker today is an example of how the new cool guys are geographers. I'm sorry, Timur is an urban and cultural geographer by training. He received his both MA and PhD from the University of California in Los Angeles. And he has a very interesting method. He combines ethnographic and archival work to explore the intersection between urban experience and religious belief in 20th century Turkey. And he has a particular focus on the neighborhood of Eyüp in Istanbul, which will be very familiar to most of you. And he has been supported for his research by several institutions, several prestigious institutions, I should say, including the American Research Institute in Turkey, the Institute of Turkish Studies, and of course, Fulbright, institutions that, supported some of the best scholars in our field, and unfortunately, they are no longer able to do so. And we all hope that at least some of these will, come back to life in the near future. I am not going to list all of his publications. He has a very long publication record, and I'm just going to mention the title of his book, published in 2023, I believe, by the UCLA Press, titled "Placing Islam in Istanbul: Building Stories and Belonging in a Changing City." So today's talk will be based on this book, an overview of this book, perhaps with a special focus on one of the chapters. And as usual, we'll be taking questions after the talk, either through the chat box. You can type your questions there, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand and you can ask your question in person. So welcome, Timur. Now the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just get screen sharing set up. İpek, first of all, thank you very much for the generous opportunity to join everyone today. Allison, thank you for helping to organize. Herkese hoş geldin. Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate you being here in these strange, weird times. and we should be all set here. But it's really a pleasure to be with you today, to join you today. The talk today, as Ipek introduced, most of it is going to be an overview of my book, which was published in 2023. It's, as I was noting and sharing this link on Facebook, it is hard to believe that it's actually nearly been 2 years. In May, it will be 2 years since the book has actually been out. But the book is Placing Islam, Geographies of Connection in 20th-Century Istanbul. If you are interested in a smaller section of it, a sort of a condensed version of some of this argument, I don't necessarily know whether geography is the next cool thing, but there is an attempt to think through some of the ways that thinking geographically might help us thinking about questions of the urban sacred. And so I have a short chapter in the much broader and really interesting handbook that Carolyn T., Fabio Vicini, and Philip Dorrell have organized called the Oxford Handbook of Religion in Turkey. And so you can find that as well. Let me make sure I've got time. There we are. So in the talk today, I want to give you just a welcome to Ayub. I know we have an audience. Actually, we've got a couple people who at least are from Ayub, a couple people who are very familiar, of course, with Istanbul, so we don't need to spend too much time about this. But to sort of set the stage for how I'm thinking about this place, I'll spend most of my time giving an overview of sort of the key interventions that I think the book makes, and then sort of lead into a question about scales of heritage and thinking about one chapter in particular, about the transformation of Ayub during the 1980s and 1990s. And perhaps, depending on time, close with a couple of quick conclusions and open up for question and answer. So, welcome to Ayub. This is, again, for people who know Ayub, this is perhaps the opposite way that you would begin by thinking about this place, but it is a way of remembering that what Ayub is has everything to do with how we come to learn about what it is. So a place, in other words, never simply exists, but places are always shaped by the ways that we come to encounter them. And I actually open with this Google screenshot of the search panel because it brings together a couple of really quite interesting things. First of all, the way in which you search for Ayub and we are given Ayub Sultan, which is a particular history of municipal politics in post 2016 Turkey, a particular map of the municipality of Ayub, and then a particular way of narrating what this place is. My own encounter with Ayub came by way actually of Orhan Pamuk, reading his memoir for my master's thesis, Istanbul Memories in the City. And in that book, Pamuk has a chapter where he talks about going to Ayub, where he describes it as, quote, a sort of Turkish Eastern Muslim Disneyland. And even as somebody who didn't know very much about Ayub at that time, that struck me as a interesting but also problematic way of talking about places, talking about the kinds of histories that were put into them. And the argument that I made in my master's thesis, and I don't think this is a novel intervention, the argument was that picture of Ayub, that way of representing this place, said far more about Pamuk and his own particular kind of like social background in the city than it did about the neighborhood itself. And so I began a project, thinking in a dissertation project, how could we tell a history of this district? And what would thinking historically about this center of Muslim pilgrimage, the center of Istanbul's Muslim geographies, in what way could telling a 20th century history of this neighborhood help us think differently about a broader sort of set of urban geographies of Islam? I was really grateful and very lucky to receive support from a couple of institutions, especially the American Research Institute in Turkey, and also Fulbright. And so I had 2 years, most of the research for the book comes out of 2 years of dissertation fieldwork between 2011 and 2013. And that took a variety of forms. It took a lot of time. A lot of what I did was just spending time in the neighborhood. I ended up teaching English in a small little community center just behind, in an old Sibyan Mektebi, just behind the mosque itself. I took classes in reading Ottoman Turkish. I became friends with and sort of just spent a lot of time wandering through the neighborhood, sitting, reading gravestones, sitting in the mosque, sitting in the square outside the mosque, interviewing people who were longtime residents of the neighborhood and kind of coming to understand the different ways that they narrated this history. Learning about places like Eyüp Şark Kahvesi, which was run by Metin Heper. The Heper family was a sort of really central figure in the late 19th century, early 20th century history of the mosque. And Metin Heper ran a small cafe, which was sort of used to be immediately on the square, which was up until the 1980s, up until the 1990s, a really central site for people's encounter with this neighborhood. It was destroyed, and actually was destroyed in the context of the 1990s, but it was what I came to realize, that the story of Ayyub was not simply a story of sort of official religion, but was sort of caught up in a much more complicated tapestry, complicated texture of lived Islam, lived memories, questions about history, identity, movement, migration, urban change, restoration, and more. The neighborhood, for people who don't necessarily know Istanbul well, the neighborhoods where the sort of the cluster of places that I focused on were really the small section, the small a couple of mahalle neighborhoods beginning immediately outside of the Byzantine city walls, Byzantine land walls, and extending up the Golden Horn a little bit, just to sort of below the Great Hill where you still have the cemetery today. And so again, spending a lot of time just in that dense cluster of Ottoman era monuments. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about how this is transformed in the 1990s, but the bulk of my time was spent in this neighborhood. And sort of, again, kind of thinking a couple of the sites that are important to this. The cemetery outlined in red, Fesane, also just a little bit below, Zal Mahmud Pasha Jami, another key site, and a couple of the neighborhoods that were sort of central to where I am. Ayyub is, of course, most known for the Mosque of Ayyub Sultan, the place at its center, and this is sort of where my point of departure for this project. The Mosque of Ayyub Sultan is home to the tomb of Khalid bin Zayd Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, the companion of the Prophet Muhammad. Khalid bin Zayd's tomb is miraculously discovered either immediately before or immediately after the conquest of Istanbul. And it comes to be, as Chidem Kafis Ciolu has kind of argued and so eloquently, and other people like Feday Coşkun have kind of extended and helped us understand, comes to be a really crucial site through which the Ottoman Empire comes to transform a Byzantine Christian Constantinople into a Muslim Istanbul. So in many ways, this is the first purpose-built mosque, or purpose-built mosque endowed by the sultans. But my interest in the neighborhood was really focusing on the 20th century, and that there's a broader question. We can talk about the historiography of this, but it was a feeling that the Ottoman era of this mosque had been ably discussed in a variety of ways, but there had been less attention to some of the ways that this neighborhood and this mosque has sort of continued on and had these complex lives over the course of the 20th century, which we often think of as a period of secularization, modernization, industrialization. So what did it mean to think in sort of to look for the complex and shifting experience of Islam in the city during a 20th century, which we often think of as being defined by these other processes? So key interventions of the book. I'm really happy with the book. I'm very proud of how it turned out, but I do think there is a way that the book tries to do many different things. It tries to speak in many different audiences. I am a geographer, as my committee, my tenure mentorship committee in the department always reminded me. They said, that's fine that you're interested in speaking to other disciplines and bringing geography to those disciplines, but you need to tell us why you matter to geography. And so I had to sort of try to make an intervention and contribution to what geographers said. I was trying to speak to a scholarship on Islamic studies, but it was also trying to be in conversation with a really rich and complicated body of scholarship in Ottoman and Turkish studies as well. There are ways that I think this worked. We can talk about ways that this probably maybe tried to do too much, but one of the key starting points, the broad interventions for this, has to do with thinking geographically about Islam. So here there's a much broader debate that this is part of, but Shahab Ahmed's book, What is Islam, sort of represents, is emblematic for a particular way that many Islamic studies scholars have talked about Islam, where the question is, what is it? And the geographic intervention, what geographers always do, is they say, actually, what we need to be doing is thinking in terms of not what something is, but where it is. And the argument that I make in the book, we can talk more about this, is that often the ways that scholars trained in Islamic studies think about geography tends to flatten or conceal other ways of thinking geographically. That for me, the concept of place provides one sort of really rich and resonant way of thinking about this. So one argument of the book, and if you had to say the broadest argument, is instead of beginning by asking what Islam is, we should begin by asking where it is. And then to do that, we study the complicated ways that people make places, and in the process locate Islam and being Muslim in the world in particular ways. There are other things that the book tries to do, and one of the parts of this, of the sort of introduction and the sort of conceptual intervention, has to do with how I think about geography. So many of us, when we encounter geography or sort of geographic theory, talk about space. Most notably, if you are reading in spatial theory, you will probably encounter either somebody like David Harvey or the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre, who both talk about sort of the production of space. And that's important, but one thing that I have found is that there's often an idea that when we think of space as being a kind of container, and the idea that those sort of containers are nested in particular kinds of ways. And the book tries to offer a different way of thinking about geography, is not created by these sort of containers, but instead think about geographies as made through particular kinds of connection. And so in this context, to make a place is to create a place, create a where, by connecting it elsewhere, to other places, to other times, to other people. When we share place, when we are able to occupy the same place together, we come to an agreement about what connections matter. Often when we get disagreements about what a place is, one of the things at stake in those disagreements is the precise nature of connections at play. And so again, we can talk some more about this. One of the other sort of points of intervention in thinking about this project, learning a lot from scholars like Jenny White and Jihan Tuol, both of whom have really rich traditions of scholarship for thinking about questions of local politics. So in both cases, though, they're thinking about place, they're thinking about geography is often framed through a question, the local. And one of the things that I, again, try to offer as a way of thinking is that place is not precisely local, that they're not exactly the same thing. And I do think one of the things the book tries to do is to look at this very specific site in a small neighborhood of Istanbul, but to kind of think about the ways that this site is connected elsewhere in a whole variety of ways through a whole variety of mediations. Something else that I was thinking of, and I think this is especially important as we're both thinking about Turkey and thinking about the United States today and the particular ways that the politics of history is being reconfigured, is being very clear that a history of place is not a history of origins. So often you will find a story, particularly if you're reading Islamist cultural politics or people who are writing in that vein, they will talk about Ayub as the site from which, the first place from which the conquest of Istanbul comes to be narrated. And so there's a way of saying that a history of Ayub can get folded into a history of origins that then justifies a particular cultural history in the present. And so one of the arguments that I make and what I'm trying to think through, and here it's learning from people like Jeremy Walton, who's kind of discussion of chronotopes. It is thinking the arguments that Cemal Kafadar has kind of made very ably in his kind of thinking about the history of the Ottoman Empire and the ways that the history of the Ottoman Empire is told. The metaphor he argues of to tell the history of the Ottoman Empire not as an onion, but as a garlic, and kind of to think about the particular implications for what that is. To tell a history of Ayub, and particularly a history of 20th century Ayub, is not to place Khalid bin Zayd at the sort of that essence, at the sort of unchanging essence at the center of the city, but is instead to think about the ways that many kinds of histories, many kinds of peoples come together. There's a grounded history in this place, but it doesn't resolve into a neat history of essences. The broad architecture the book tries to offer as a way for thinking about this is one that I call building stories. And here it is, playing on the words in English, the ways that stories are built. Stories are material things. They are built, realized through bodies that tell them, through things like books, through the buildings that sort of materialize a particular narrative about history. But it's also a way of understanding that buildings, or sort of like at the physical built environment, never mean something on their own. They always require ways of telling stories about who belongs there, about how they come to be significant, about the different kinds of movements and connections that are woven through these sites. And so building stories for me becomes an analytic that sort of helps us pull all of these things together. It was also a term that helped me particularly think about a set of concepts that emerge very much in my process of research, these words of riwayat and bina, and thinking here about some of the broader concepts that frame our understandings of Turkey, particularly in the context of the 20th century. So we're all very familiar as scholars of sort of Ottoman and Turkish studies, the ways that the study of 20th century Turkey has been framed around questions of secularization, modernization, questions of the state. These are crucial, of course. These are really, really important concepts that frame our study. But in thinking in particular about rivayet, which is a term in Turkish, of course, as many of us know, that can both take on a very particular religious valence. When you read hadith, for example, what will almost always say such and such companion of the Prophet, sahabe, rivayet eder ki, or rivayet olan, ravi olan. So it's a particular word that comes to do with hadith transmission. So it's thinking rivayet has this kind of interesting valence of sort of a particular reminding us of the ways that hadith emerge as sort of these products of transmission. But rivayat can also have a more colloquial sense in the ways that it is both a story, it is a narrative, it is a tale. It can sort of sometimes carry the meaning of gossip. And so the sort of slippage between those two things was always really striking for me and a sort of interesting for me to think about the context, think about Eyüp in particular, because Eyüp has often been told and framed as simply a sort of unchanging religious place. Bina, of course, is probably less conceptually freighted. It's just an interest in the built environment. But these two concepts then come to structure how the book is organized. So the first chapter, the first major chapter, traces different moments in which the story of Khalid bin Zayd has been told. So I look at a period in the 1920s, I look at the period in the 1950s, and then I look at sort of my contemporary period in 2011, 2012, thinking about how the story of Khalid bin Zayd has been told. There are, of course, continuities, but trying to pull out a couple of nuances to think about how storytelling as an act of placemaking is always contextually specific. It speaks to particular audiences in a time and place. The next chapter in that section focuses on stories of Ayyub and thinking about particular what we could think of as old Islam or being reconfigured in 1950s Istanbul. So in a decade of really far-reaching urban and social change, what place did Ayyub occupy in this kind of broader cultural urban imaginary? Was always struck, and this has to do a lot with, again, how we think about geography, that in all of these conversations about Ayyub, there's never a map, which always for me suggested this interesting insight that there's a sort of lived social topography in ways that Amy Mill has talked about quite effectively. A lived social topography that's sort of understood by residents of Istanbul, like, oh yeah, Ayyub is there. So it sort of occupies this imagined place that is at the same time located in a particular relation, both to times and sort of the broader city. And the third section, the third chapter in that section, explored what I was playing around with the idea of fluid stories. And here it's thinking about Rivayet also has an interesting kind of etymological connection to the idea of flow. But thinking about the ways that stories often about Ayyub will turn on the question of water. So people, the role that water plays, and then thinking about how water and encounters with water form a key part of many people's devotional experience of visiting Ayyub Sultan. So historically, when people would visit the tomb itself, there is a well located in the tomb itself that is called by many people Zemzem Kuyu. I mean, so it's as a called, sort of imagined to be or understood to be connected to the waters of Zemzem, which was an interesting idea. There are a set of fountains that exist in the courtyard. So thinking about the interesting ways that those fountains fit in. There's a topography of wells as well within the broader district. Talking a little bit about the Sibil and the sort of the offer of giving water. And so it was a way of sort of considering how water occupies this interesting, the materiality of water has been mobilized in a variety of ways to tell stories about place. The second section on Bina, on building, opens with a discussion of 1990s transformation made during the 1990s and 2000s, what I call Ottoman topographies. And I'll talk some more about this. I have one eye on time, but I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. I have a chapter thinking about the discrepant itineraries of tourists and pilgrims in Ayyub Sultan, sort of in the context of 2011, 2012, 2013. What does it mean to visit Ayyub as a religious pilgrim? What does it mean to visit as a cultural tourist? And I was especially interested in the ways that, I mean, those immediately map onto distinctions between what we call domestic and foreign tourists. Foreign tourists are often understood to be visiting for as a heritage project. Domestic tourists are understood to be visiting as a perhaps more religious devotional project. But I was interested in that chapter, particularly in domestic tourists from Turkey and from Istanbul in particular, who were visiting these sites. So thinking about the ways that tourism, this question of ziyaret was being understood, and how that shaped encounters between people in the built environment, but also between different groups of people in this context. And then the final chapter in that section thinks about the urban politics of sharing place during Ramadan. So I happened to be doing my field work between 2011 and 2013, which means I observed Ramadan in 2012 and 2013. It comes at a very interesting moment in municipal politics. At the time, Ayyub's mayor was somebody named Ismail Kavuncu, who was then widely known and widely understood to be very much connected to the Gulen movement. And there's sort of a complicated urban politics that plays out in the aftermath. But I was interested in how debates about public space, about sort of appropriate ways of celebrating iftar, about questions of class, about questions of knowledge, but also the ways in which, say, broader debates that were then going to emerge in the context of Gezi about conspicuous consumption, about sort of the urban rents generated by redevelopment and by these Ramadan experiences. What did it mean to turn Ramadan into very much a spectacle of consumption? And so the chapter was thinking about that, but closed for me in like a really meaningful way of finding despite all of that, also finding the people and encounters with people who come to Ayyub very much as a question of a sort of simple, both individual devotional act, but also one about sort of a really modest shared experience of the divine that I found quite moving in my field work. And it is something that I sort of deliberately tried to close that chapter by thinking about. So that's a very broad overview of kind of what I think the book does in its interventions. I want to talk a little bit about something that I've yet to write about, but I've been thinking about emerging about this. But one question that comes out of this is thinking about heritage as a scalar question. So often academic and popular discussions rely on heritage, rely on scalar metaphors. So we'll talk about local, national, global as a sort of like three tiers that we think about. So at one end is the local, at the other end is the global or world. And then in the middle somehow are the contested debates about national heritage, the key terrain for our history. Again, as anybody who's at all familiar with the context of Turkey and the ways in which the politics of Ottoman nostalgia have played out. Bizim ecdadımız, our grandfathers, to think about that. So this is very much for me a scalar question. It's interesting though, because then the ways that local heritage, that scale comes to sort of matter in interesting ways. So the ways in which heritage is valued, local heritage is seen to be less important than the national heritage sits in an uneasy relationship with world heritage. And here we could think to the interesting debates over Hagia Sophia. Is the Hagia Sophia a national, or is it, again, you could say as a Muslim site, is it a world heritage site? I do find it interesting in this context to think about think in terms of scale, because it's a reminder that defining heritage is a project of defining where it is. So that question of scalar framing is an attempt to say this is where heritage matters and the people to whom it should matter. But it's a reminder, as geographers call it, that scale is a category of practice. It is not a fixed thing. It is always open to revision and contestation. So as geographers thinking geographically about heritage, we ask, how is scale defined and mobilized to create an object of heritage that then matters in interesting ways? So I tried to think a little bit about that in my chapter on Ottoman topographies. Um, so Eyüp is, of course, known for the Mosque of Eyüp Sultan. It is known for the network of tombs and medreses and mezarlık and tekkes that sit sort of like densely at the center of the neighborhood. But Eyüp is also known because it's a site, an important site in the industrialization of the late Ottoman Empire. And so here we're looking at Fesane. Fesane is one of the first factories built by the Ottoman Empire along the shore, built along really into the property of a former imperial palace. It is nationalized and becomes part of Sümerbank following the sort of political and economic reorganization of the early republic. And from 1923 to 1985 comes to be a really central site of a social and economic life. People would tell me, and this is if anybody who knows Eyüp, the sort of the factory whistle became this thing that everybody in the neighborhood would hear. I mean, it would sort of define sort of the temporality of the neighborhood. And this massive complex, and here's a photo from the 1960s, comes to be a really, again, a key site in the sort of social and economic experience of the neighborhood. There's a story that I haven't written about, but was, this is a set of photographs that showed up in the archives of one of the preservation boards, and it was always striking to me in 1976 the ways in which the walls of Fesane had become this site for graffiti because of the ways that struggles between the left and the right are playing out in the neighborhood of Eyüp itself. There's a sort of topography to leftist and rightist neighborhoods, and I think Fesane was right near the boundary between them. Here's an image in 1985, sort of the last years of Fesane. And there isn't this interesting thing that happens that even though the factory is sort of built up around it, there were places within the factory, because how the factory was built, that you can still see sort of elements of the old Ottoman palaces that are built into or around which the factory itself was built. And so the vaulted windows that you see in the background, prepared in a report by Nezih Aldem. And so in this, as we're thinking, and was the chapter tries to explain, several things are coming together in the 70s and 80s. One of them is a broader shift in how we think about the objects of World Heritage. So it's a shift from simply monumental buildings to a broader urban fabric. So the idea of the kent dokusu, the urban fabric, comes to be seen as something worthy of protection even beyond the sort of the monuments themselves. This is also a moment when you have the ongoing urbanization of Istanbul, which had already happened elsewhere, but is very much at play in at least parts of Eyüp. And we do have the expanded road infrastructure, and we have, again, because where Eyüp was located, we have really large districts of informal housing as well. The September 1980 coup makes possible the privatization of state businesses like Sümerbank. And then there's also an attempt under the administration of Bedrettin Dalan to reinvent central Istanbul as a tourist destination following the removal of its industrial core. So Dalan will famously bulldoze the Haliç, bulldoze the Golden Horn, in order to sort of move industry to the peripheries of the city and create the sort of the center of Istanbul as a new sort of cultural heritage destination, particularly for international or global tourists. This plays out in a really interesting way in the context of Fesane, because much of the factory or much of the complex is destroyed, except for the core buildings right at the center. In reports that the municipality is putting out, and this is a reorganized municipality in the 1980s, there's the idea that it will be, one of the first ideas is that it'll be a museum of industry. So the idea it'll be a museum of textile and industry. But very quickly after that, IKSV enters the project, or enters the chat, so to speak. And this is a moment where the Istanbul Biennial is first coming to be organized. And so IKSV looks at Fesane and says, oh, this is going to be like London's Tate. So in the same way that the Tate Modern is built into a former factory space, there's the idea that Festhane will be the symbol of a new modern art museum. And so they host the third International Istanbul Biennial there. And it's with the understanding that Festhane will come to be the home of the new modern art museum. This is happening, as the news clipping says, this is happening in 1992. This is also a moment, Nezih Aldem is another important figure, and we can talk some more about what he does. He's a really important architect in 20th century Turkey, but he's also a native of Eyüp. He's born and raised in the neighborhood, and he comes to work on a volunteer basis for the planning department in the 1980s, and has a whole set of plans that he's trying to realize along with many of the other people who are working there, to sort of recover what he sees as the sort of the core urban fabric, and a whole set of plans that are now available, largely available through SALT research. And the local municipality sets out trying, under sort of the direction of Nezih Aldem, but also with a whole set of other people who are working as part of the municipality, do everything that they can to preserve the civil architecture. So they're undertaking a variety of things to do this. In some ways they're successful, but they run into a roadblock. And so there's an interesting moment then what happens in 1994. So this is where we have the famous election where Refah wins the election, both in the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, Büyükşehir Belediyesi, but also in Eyüp itself. And so what happens, as with the sort of the broader municipal election, it's a split election. It's a very polarized or fragmented electorate. But Refah, in the case of Eyüp, someone named Ahmet Genç, wins a plurality of the votes and comes to office. And one of the things that they were doing in 1992 and 1993 is arguing very forcefully, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, against things like turning Festhane into a modern art museum. As they say, I think in one editorial that they put in a sort of party newspaper, whose culture are you trying to sell to who? So there's an interesting debate playing out in the context of Eyüp about, again, which culture matters, which culture should be sort of at the center of this place. And very quickly, following their election in 1994, they embark on sort of a rapid restoration project, trying to, as they say, in Vakit, return to essences, öze dönüş. So the idea sort of enrolled in this project that these mosques and historic works have been used as stables and depots, and now that they're embracing their old identities. So again, a particular politics of heritage that's playing out in the 1990s. There's a broader history to think about the ways in which the Eyüp municipality really tries to then frame this local, what we would think of as a local place-based identity, as part of a much broader sort of global story. And we can talk some more about how that happens. But one of the places that I always found really interesting, if you've been to Eyüp, you may have noticed this fountain. It is located immediately behind the Mosque of Eyüp Sultan on the hill, going up to the cemetery, depending on who you talk to, either the Eyüp Sultan Tepesi or Pierre Loti or İdrisi Bitlis Tepesi, depending on who you talk to about what its proper name is. But there's a fountain here. And the fountain, Ebedi Eyüp Sultanlılar. So again, a particular sort of politics of naming. And then just beneath it is an inscription written in Ottoman Turkish. And I don't remember how the inscription exactly runs, but it is actually a sign of marking this as a donation of Mayor Ahmet Genç, the mayor of Eyüp at the time. And so it signals the really interesting ways that sort of these images of the Ottoman past are sort of reoriented or reconfigured to sort of speak to this particular kind of moment, the cultural politics of, I think, 2002 is when this is built. So there are, some broader things that we could talk about, struggles of the scale of heritage. Again, thinking very much about the current moments and where the debates about Istanbul Büyükşehir Belediyesi is and the ways in which, in an interesting way, under İmamoğlu, they've very much deliberately, I think, pivoted how they're thinking about heritage. So there's a conversation there. One of the interesting things is how Fesane has been reinvented yet again as a modern art museum. I'm talking a little bit about that. Maybe a couple of thoughts then to finish out today's sort of lecture discussion and then open up for questions and answers. There's some broader points, I think, to think about how we understand the Islamicness of Istanbul. The argument that I think the book sets up and opens up a broader way of thinking about is how the Islamicness of Istanbul, or these claims about what Islam is, are claims about where it is and where it should be located. And this is again where the idea of place for me becomes one especially useful concept and way of thinking about these broader struggles. The chapter that I talked about of Ottoman topographies is a particular moment in between the 1970s and 1990s, an attempt to rescale heritage in order to justify this political program in urban transformation. One of the struggles playing out right now in Turkey, but it is not unique to Turkey. We see this playing out in a different context in the United States, is the ways about these scale making projects are being defined and contested. And so we can, I think that's less developed in the book, but it's certainly one of the things that the book opens up or sort of points to as a place for further conversation. And I think that wraps up the conversation there. So thank you very much for your attention. Really excited to open up questions and answers.
Thank you. Thank you, Timur, for this really interesting talk. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions. As I mentioned, you can put these in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand and ask it yourself. I'm sorry, I had to mute myself for a second. There are, as I mentioned, my office doesn't have a door, so if you hear some sounds from the background, please ignore them. And maybe I can just ask well, Feyza actually is raising her hand. I'll let her ask the first question, and then I can ask my question later once I figure out what is going on in the background. Feyza, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Timur. That was an amazing recap of your book, which I love. And as I told you before, I'm from Eyüp, born and raised. And yeah, there's so much that I can talk about and like resonating with your project and everything. But one thing that you mentioned, but you didn't really unpack, was the question of class that you mentioned with the Ramadan festivals and stuff, especially after Ahmet Genç. And I remember like when I was a child, Eyüp being a much more like a middle class, and now it turned into like a more like a working class neighborhood for the Islamic neighborhoods. Did you see that kind of a transformation as well?
Yeah.
Just if you anything to add about like the question of class in this cultural heritage and questions of culture.
I mean, there was, so in 2000, the big debate that played out between 2012 and 2013 had to do with the ways that the square in front of the mosque was being used. So for people who don't know sort of how the topography of Eyüp works out, of the mosque works out, the mosque sits immediately next to a big open square. And that open square used to be a çarşı, which was torn down in the 1950s, and then was used as a taxi stand and bus station from the 1950s. It was paved over, but it was used as a taxi stand and bus station, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and then it's pedestrianized in the 1990s. This is one of the things that the Ahmet Genç administration does. One of the things that then has come to be interesting about it is how this square would be used as a supplemental prayer space particularly during Friday prayers or during Ramadan during Tarawih. And so the square and there would be then a sort of crew of cleaning staff associated with the municipality who would often sort of try to sort of clean things out and put down carpets and make sure that this is all available. So this plays out in 2012 because Ahmed Genç had created a whole set of, often would create these like elaborate Ramadan events. Ismail Kavuncu decided he no longer wanted to do this for his reasons associated. I don't know why, but decided he didn't want to do this. And so what happened in 2012, that year in Ramadan, was there was no event held in the square. And so what happened is you had large numbers of family, often working class, would come down and bring their sofra and sit in the square and create basically small little sofra just sitting out in the square. And for those families, it becomes a really wonderful thing. You're able to like have to have the call to prayer and have your iftar immediately in the context of in this like very close proximity to this like sacred site, and it's like bir Ramazan havası. Like it has an atmosphere that I think was really appealing to a lot of people. This was fiercely critiqued, and it was critiqued both on the grounds of disorder, of saying like düzensiz, like so there was a sense of, and particularly a class dimension where it was like middle class looking at sort of working class being like, you're out of sort of like, this is, yeah, it's düzensiz bir şey. But then also what has happened is that many of the restaurants, many of the buildings located along the square itself had been turned into restaurants. And these restaurants are selling sort of Ramadan iftar packages that were well beyond actually what even middle-class residents of Eyüp would be able to afford, and were often sort of speaking to a sort of much wealthier, depending on where you went, politically connected. You would find people, you know, dernekler, cemaatler, AKP içinde olanlar would gather and go to these iftar. And so they're looking and like complaining that their view, their experience of Eyüp as being spoiled by düzensiz, ignorant cahil olan. I mean, and it was critiqued, so critiqued in a variety of ways. What happens the following year is Kavuncu hears this and is very aware of his, he's very aware of sort of municipal politics attached to this. And so very deliberately creates a set, they build what they call revaklar, like, so they built these like fiberglass arcades in this area that are built to look like Mecca and create a sort of a more thing. And also at the same time makes it impossible for people to come down and have their iftar in these spaces. So it's partly about a question of class. It's partly about a question of sort of what is appropriate use of public space. And it is one of the things that I think the book could and should have done more. Like there's much more to be talked about in that context, but hopefully that's like Feyza, like one small part of sort of unpacking some of those questions.
Thank you so much. I just want to add one more thing to that debate that I've kept hearing about. The class dimension is definitely there, but also the critiquing the Islamness of what people do in there, right? The middle class who are in the restaurants are saying this is popular Islam, that's not Islam, you know, this is bid'ah or whatever. And when you look at the picnic table, I mean, on the street, right? Those people, for them, Islam is that. Yeah. Togetherness, that collectivity. So that was really fascinating to me as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a question I'm going to read in the chat box. It's from Ali Spahi. Very nice to see you, Timur. I'm in a noisy street right now, so I'll write here, but we can see him. His camera is turned on. One, I believe that the social history of the late Ottoman period is very unplaced and instead is very spatial oriented, i.e. power relations, local governance, etc. I think your emphasis on where question is also a very important intervention to Ottoman new historiography in general. If you have comments on this. 2, what do you think of using the term biography of place? Some are against it, but I like the idea, but I understand it may be limiting because it calls for a life cycle type of thinking. Is there a discussion in your area about it? Question of a personal interest. So ignore if it doesn't interest you.
Yeah. Ali, thank you. Great to see you. Those are great questions. So I think I would agree with you to your point about the unplaced nature of social history. One thing that I don't know, but I have a feeling about is that often when people say they're writing the social history of Istanbul, for example, they're really only writing the social history of Beyoğlu. Not always, but I think there comes, and sometimes people are more nuanced and attentive to those kinds of things, but there is a way, and this is partly an archival problem of like where the archives, like what archives we have and where those archives can be organized and who collects those archives. So I think there are at least two questions, the unplaced nature of social history. One of them has to do with conceptually, how do we understand the where that we study? Like what is the where, what is the geography of the object that we study? And then the other question that is part of this is what is the geography or topography of the archive itself? In what ways? And you know, these are not like new questions. Yeat's also on the call or on the Zoom, but I think those are, so they're the two small ways that I think where really matters to those conversations. I don't know that, yeah, I think it's something that my book maybe like opens up. It doesn't really engage with it in a systematic sense, but I think those are really a really important thing. And a last point about this question of where is maybe there's also less attention to how different groups come to understand that they live in the same place. So there's a way to say like Cem Behar's work, for example, which is amazing, the Mahalle in Istanbul. But what his work doesn't do, and again, his book is amazing, but what his work doesn't do is it doesn't explore as much how people have actually they can be in the same location and have very different ideas of what that place is. And this comes through very forcefully in Eyüp, where you can be in the same physical place as like the person right next to you. And yet your sense of like what this place is, why it matters, how it matters, what you should be doing can be totally different. And sometimes this experience aligns, but sometimes it doesn't. And sort of being attentive to that, I think, is really quite an interesting thing. I think your second point, biography of a place, I think is great. So the geographer Karen Till has an article where she critiques some of the idea of biography of place. The argument I would make is, I think it's valuable, except it comes back to a question of how you conceptualize the object whose biography you're telling. So if we think of biography as a person, like if we think of place as a person, the limit is that there's one way to tell a biography as though it's just an internal set of things, like a person, what are their thoughts, what are their experiences, how do they move through life? A biography of place, though, could be, how is this place embedded in a shifting set of relations that are outward looking? So I think it partly gets to this question of sort of how you think about place. For me, Karen Till has been really quite good in that, and Doreen Massey, the geographer, has a brilliant short essay called Places in Their Pasts that I've always found really good and sort of inspiring to think with in that context.
Thank you.
Okay,
May I ask something?
yeah, sure.
Timur, thanks so much, and it's great to see many of you. Ali, I haven't seen you for a long while. I mean, it's really great. So this is Friday OTSA meetings is great for that as well. I mean, among other things, of course. Timur, I like your book, and I learned a lot. I'm assigning this for an upcoming graduate seminar with mostly history students. So to talk about, what can we learn from geography or geographical approaches, spatial approaches to history. We'll probably criticize as well, but I mean, that's graduate maximalism,
Yeah.
graduate class maximalism, right? What you said before the question of biography of the place is, I think, very important. It's the beating heart of your book, right? I mean, people can be in the same space and can understand, still can perceive the same place in different ways, can experience the same place in different ways, right? I think it's also somewhat, and especially in the case of Abe, closely related with the subtle political messages that are given through Abe. So I guess that amplify that impact and those different perceptions, right? I mean, Erdogan going to morning prayer, sabah namazı after every victory. So it doesn't, it's very subtle. It doesn't make much sense to the secular mahalle, but of course, to his base, that's a very strong, very explicit message, right? And people understand that. If I ask you to expand upon that, I mean, how historical it is, I mean, can we apply this to different periods of history, or is it just something that was mostly deployed with the 2000s, perhaps with the 1990s and then 2000s?
Yeah.
Has it always been like that in the case of Abe?
So one of the things I remember, and this is not in the book at all, but I think there's a lot more people would talk. So actually, there's what is his name? Hikmet Kıvılcı?
Kıvılcımlı, yeah. Eyüp, the famous Eyüp talk you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Vatan Partisi, yeah.
So I mean that he has the Abe talk is always this like really, so there's like a very different way of kind of standing in front of Ayup and sort of mobilizing what Ayup is and why it matters. I think there's more to be, certainly not in my book, but much more to be written about the 1970s and the ways that, say, street protests or like social movements are being organized through this place. I'm thinking like Christopher Houston's book about Istanbul. The title is escaping me, but so he does this amazing sort of phenomenological set of interviews with people who are involved in 1970s revolutionary politics. One of the things, though, that he doesn't do as much in that book, as far as I remember, is think about the experience of place and how people were telling, like he's very much interested in sort of the phenomenology of bodies. So I think there is more to be writing about. Erbakan also comes to Ayup in the 1970s. There are stories about him, and he has really small audiences in the 1970s. I think he comes and gives, and you would find other moments in which, people will come and sort of organize small rallies in Ayup and Feyza. You also maybe somebody who like may have seen these growing up as well. You would have sort of small little social groups would organize a protest or organize an event, sometimes right next to the mosque. I don't know that answers. Yeah, so I think your question is a really good one, that the ways in which that is coming to be organized. And a last point about this is the really complicated politics of Cemaatler. Obviously, the Gülen movement uses Ayup as a site, like it's sort of woven into. You would have the abiler who would come and would go to Cuma namazı, and then they would go to one of the restaurants that had been owned by somebody associated with the movement, and they would gather there and have a nice meal, and then they would go off. But you have the Nurcular as well. Like this really, the place where I was teaching was associated with the İlim Yayma Vakfı. And so you would have this group who would come and like, they have a very different set of things. They would come and visit they would sort of visit a couple of sites, like the place I was working, and then go and make sure, do a ziyaret to the brothers who were buried in the cemetery as well. And so it's kind of folded in their thing. When I was there in 2012, 2013, I think the Hoja who was giving who was preaching on Fridays was associated with Süleyman Cılar. And so like you would see very clearly like people who are coming associated with that Jemaat who would also make a point to come. Sometimes those align with the politics of Erdogan, but not always. And so I think like there are ways, again, that sometimes, again, these things align, but sometimes, as we see in 2014, 2015, 2016, like these very clear moments of friction and how these places are being used. So yeah, thanks for the question. Hopefully that answers a couple of things.
No, it's fascinating, which makes, of course, Hikmet Kıvılcım's Ape meeting even more interesting experience. So it's, yeah, thanks so much. And it's lovely. Thank you.
Timur, we're almost out of time. In fact, we are, I think, but I wanted to just ask a very brief question. This was such a thought-provoking presentation, and I'm afraid I haven't read the book yet, but it's definitely going on my list. And a lot of things you said really resonated with me because of the way I have experienced, neighborhoods in Istanbul. And also, by the way, thank you so much for making this presentation without a single reference to the, Islamic city trope. And like, instead we had this, different temporalities, thinking about, our relationship with the city. And as others have brought up, how, that is more dependent on who we are than anything else, and we experience it in extremely different ways. The other thing that I wanted to give you a chance to maybe talk a little bit more about was what you said about container geographies and connected geographies. And like I said, this Eyüp is a special place, but for someone who is familiar with another, I'm thinking about all these different neighborhoods in Istanbul that had their own character, and they were, self-contained units. My experience is about Anadolu Hisarı, for instance, with its own character, and how, there are people who are from there, and then others who are, anybody who's not from that neighborhood is an outsider, right? And everybody knows the unspoken code and everything. But this is something that inevitably was not going to withstand modernization. And that's something I know it's a word concept that we did not want to talk about. But I mean, just the way infrastructure projects have connected the city. Now everybody, even though in their different way, now more people can experience Anadolu Hisarı, more people can experience Eyüp, and they're connected. These geographies are now connected in a way that they never were connected before. And I'm also like in particular thinking about Feshane, what has happened to Feshane. It's possible to look at it as, separate from Eyüp, but I think it's now more connected to Eyüp than it has ever been. And in that sense, even though ideologically these are at entirely different points on the spectrum, these are very complementary projects, evolving in a way, I don't want to say inevitable, but not divergent either. So I was wondering if you could at least like briefly comment a little bit about this, contained versus connected, and what we can say about Eyüp today, and maybe like a few comments about gentrification as well that didn't come up, but it is so important for these neighborhoods.
Yeah. So one thing, sort of container, sort of at a broad conceptual level, connected and container. I think we need both probably to think about geography. Like, so first is like we need both ways to think about where we are. But the idea, and this is one of to Yiğit's question, but also to your question about Anadolu Hisar, and the idea of sort of locals, yerli olanlar, mahalleli olanlar, and olmayanlar. There can be a tendency to sort of romanticize the sort of like the local hermetic sort of like internally consistent thing. I don't know though that that's tenable for like, I don't know that that's like it's a real thing when people sort of experience the loss and sort of transformation in the neighborhood, in the sense of like, why is everybody coming to my neighborhood? Mahallim bozulmuş yani. Yani mahallemizi bozanlar gibi. I do think there's something really quite interesting, sort of Istanbul as a sort of transportation infrastructure has developed. Parts of the city becoming increasingly accessible. There's an interesting way to think about how social media has also, or like media in general, but particularly now like the world of Instagram, the ways that that sort of transforms people's consumption of the city. One concept to come back to an idea of Ali's question as well, and is something that I've been sort of interested in, is what emerges are new publics. But those publics are not sort of just abstract things sort of formed in relation to media in the way that Michael Warner would talk about. But those publics are also sort of spatially located in particular kinds of ways. And like those different publics can be spatially proximate. They can sort of exist in the same place at the same time. So you can have, again, in Eyüp, somebody who's like, oh, I saw on Instagram that Fesane has an art show and I wanted to come take a selfie. And then I'm going to go and like, while I'm here, like, Jami bir gideyim bari. It's like the sense of like, well, while I'm here, I might as well go see the mosque. And then you can have somebody who says, you know, I'm coming to see, I'm part of the Nur Cemaatları, and it's really important for me to come to Friday prayer and to go see the Abiler who are buried in the cemetery. And those two people can be walking down the street at the same time. And then you can have somebody who's born and raised, who lives in Dumeciler, in one of the mahalle in there, who lives in Dumeciler, who goes to, like eats lunch at one of the small little restaurants, lokantalar, like right off the Meydan. All of those people are in the same place. And again, sometimes they can coexist. Like publics don't have to resolve into a single thing. But sometimes there are going to be those points of friction. And so sort of being attentive to how that happens. I think the goal is, and sort of like the politics of the book, or the politics, I think my politics of like, we don't have to resolve on a single vision of what a place should be. The question is, how can we sort of articulate a sense of what a common place is, that is also open, that is one grounded in some sort of history, shared history, but also open to change as well.
Okay, thank you so much. We are a little, okay. We still did quite well. We're only 10 minutes over time, and it was a pleasure. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Timur, for this wonderful presentation. Please check out the upcoming events, and like I said, we'll be back with a new series of events in September. So thank you all. Goodbye. Stay safe, be well, and kolay gelsin to everyone.